Philadelphia, June 1787. The windows of the Pennsylvania State House are sealed shut against prying ears, despite the suffocating summer heat. Inside, the air is thick with humidity and something worse, the acrid smell of a convention coming apart. Voices rise, delegates stand, chairs scrape across the floor, papers slam down on tables. Some men are not debating anymore, they are threatening. After 4 weeks of argument, nothing has been resolved. Large states and small states are locked in a deadlock that neither side will break. The fragile alliance that won independence is fracturing under the weight of trying to govern itself. One delegate has written home that the convention is held together scarce by the strength of a hair. Outside these walls, the young republic is already failing. The Articles of Confederation, the document that was supposed to bind the 13 states together, cannot tax, cannot regulate trade, cannot enforce treaties, cannot even pay the soldiers who won independence. A year earlier, armed farmers in Massachusetts had risen in open rebellion against their own government. The national government had been helpless to respond. It had no army, no money, no authority that anyone was required to respect. Many of the men in this room believe the American experiment is already over, that 13 sovereign states will drift apart, fall into war with each other, and become the cautionary tale that European monarchs have been predicting since 1776. At the center of this crisis stands a quiet, slight Virginian. He is 36 years old, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, with a soft voice that rarely carries across a large room, and a physical presence that no one would describe as commanding. But he arrived here weeks before anyone else. With a plan already written, his name is James Madison, and the document he carried into this room, before the first gavel fell, before the first argument erupted, before anyone else had defined what this convention was even supposed to accomplish, would become, with modifications born of bitter compromise, the Constitution of the United States. The revolution had been won, the independence had been declared, the British had been defeated, and then the hard part began. The Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, had been designed by men who feared centralized power above almost everything else. They had just fought a war against a distant government that taxed without representation, that quartered soldiers in private homes, that dissolved legislatures and ignored colonial charters. The last thing they wanted was to create a new version of that government with American faces. So the Articles gave Congress almost nothing. No power to tax. It could only request money from the states, which could and did refuse. No power to regulate interstate or foreign commerce, which meant 13 separate trade policies. States imposing tariffs on each other's goods, merchants unable to plan or predict. No executive to enforce the laws Congress did manage to pass. No federal judiciary to resolve disputes between states. No mechanism to compel anyone to do anything. The result, by the mid-1780s, was predictable chaos. States printed their own currencies, worthless almost immediately. They ignored the peace treaty with Britain because Congress couldn't enforce it. Foreign creditors, the French and Dutch bankers who had financed the revolution, watched the new republic default on its debts and began writing America off as a failed experiment. British troops remained in forts along the northern frontier, violating the Treaty of Paris because they had correctly calculated that the American government lacked the power to make them leave. And then Shays's Rebellion. In the summer and fall of 1786, debt-ridden Massachusetts farmers, many of them veterans who had fought for independence and received nothing but worthless paper in return, took up arms and began closing courts by force to prevent foreclosure proceedings. The national government could do nothing. No army, no money, no authority. Massachusetts had to suppress the rebellion with its own militia, and even that was uncertain for weeks. To James Madison, watching from Virginia, Shays' Rebellion was not a crisis. It was a diagnosis. Madison was not a general, not a war hero, not the kind of man whose presence silenced a room or whose voice moved crowds to action. He was something more dangerous in a constitutional crisis, a scholar who had spent years thinking about exactly this problem. Born in 1751 into Virginia's planter class, Madison had been educated at the College of New Jersey, later Princeton, where he absorbed the political philosophy of the Enlightenment with the focused intensity of a young man who had found his life's work. He devoured histories of ancient republics: Greece, Rome, the Achaean League, the Amphictyonic Council, the Italian city-states of the Renaissance. He read them not for their triumphs, but for their failures, for the patterns of collapse. And the pattern was consistent. Republics did not usually fall to external enemies. They collapsed from within. Faction, competing interests, regional divisions, class conflict tore them apart. The system failed to manage the centrifugal forces of human self-interest, and eventually the center could not hold. Madison reached a conclusion that was radical for his time and remains counterintuitive. The solution to the problem of faction was not to eliminate factions. That was impossible in a free society. But to design a system large enough and complex enough that no single faction could dominate it. A large republic with many competing interests was actually more stable than a small one. The interests would check each other. He had been working toward this insight for years. By the time he rode into Philadelphia in the spring of 1787, he had not just a theory, he had a plan. While other delegates were still deciding whether to attend, still uncertain about the convention's purpose, still packing their bags for the journey to Philadelphia, James Madison was already there, weeks early. He used the time the way a general uses the days before a battle, to prepare, to position, to ensure that when the fighting began, he would control the terrain. He met with the Virginia delegation. He lobbied arriving delegates from Pennsylvania. He drafted and refined what he called the Virginia Plan. A complete replacement for the Articles of Confederation, not a revision of them. A strong national government with 3 separate branches. A bicameral legislature with representation based on population. An executive, a federal judiciary. Power to tax, to regulate commerce, to enforce laws directly on citizens, not merely on states that could ignore requests at will. This was not a set of talking points. It was a working constitution. When the convention officially opened on May 25th, with George Washington presiding and most delegates still uncertain what they were actually there to decide, Madison had already made the critical decision for them. On May 29th, Edmund Randolph rose and presented the Virginia Plan on behalf of the delegation. The convention had been called to revise the Articles of Confederation. It was suddenly debating an entirely new form of government. Madison had seized control of the agenda before the first real debate began. Not everyone was pleased. The small states had come to Philadelphia nervous. They had read the Virginia Plan. Representation based on population meant that Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts would dominate a legislature in which Delaware and Rhode Island were afterthoughts. The small states had fought for independence too. They were not willing to trade British domination for Virginian domination. On June 15th, William Paterson of New Jersey presented a counter-proposal, the New Jersey Plan, which retained equal representation for each state regardless of population. The choice was now stark. The convention split, large states against small. The debates grew louder, more personal, more desperate. By late June, delegates were talking openly about failure. Some began quietly preparing to leave. If enough of them walked out, the convention would collapse without producing anything, and the last real chance to save the Union might go with it. Madison watched, listened, took notes. Every night by candlelight he wrote. Detailed, exhaustive records of every speech, every argument, every position taken by every delegate. The convention had agreed to strict secrecy. No official transcript was kept. Without Madison's pen, the drama of 1787 would have been almost entirely lost to history. His journals, published decades later, remain the only comprehensive account of what happened in that room. But in the moment, the notes served another purpose. They allowed Madison to track the shifting alliances, to anticipate objections, to understand exactly where the pressure points were and what compromises might be possible. He was not just recording history, he was studying it in real time, looking for the opening that would save the convention. On June 28th, at the lowest moment of the convention, the oldest man in the room rose to speak. Benjamin Franklin was 81 years old. His gout was severe enough that he had to be carried to the State House each day in a sedan chair. His voice was too weak to carry across the chamber, and he handed his remarks to James Wilson to read aloud. He did not offer a detailed plan. He did not propose a new compromise. He offered something the convention needed more urgently: perspective. He reminded the delegates of the revolution, of how they had turned to prayer during the darkest days of the war, and how the prayers had been answered. He told them that no great assembly of men had ever produced anything useful without divine guidance, and that perhaps the convention's troubles were a sign that it had forgotten to ask for it. He proposed opening each session with prayer. The motion was not adopted. The convention had no funds to pay a chaplain, some delegates noted with gentle irony. But Franklin's larger point landed. These men had survived worse. The crisis in this room was political, not existential. If they could find the will to compromise, there was still a path forward. The temperature in the room shifted, not dramatically, but enough. The solution came from Connecticut. Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth proposed what became known as the Great Compromise, a bicameral legislature in which the House of Representatives would have proportional representation, the large states' demand, and the Senate would have equal representation, 2 members from every state regardless of size, the small states' demand. It passed on July 16th by a single vote. Madison opposed it. He had wanted proportional representation in both chambers, and he believed, correctly as it turned out, that equal Senate representation would give disproportionate power to small states for generations. He wrote that the compromise gave him a vague feeling of dissatisfaction, but he accepted it because the alternative was dissolution. The convention moved forward. The remaining issues, the executive branch, the federal judiciary, the regulation of commerce, the deeply contentious question of slavery, and how enslaved people would be counted for representation, were resolved one by one through the painful, imperfect process of men who disagreed on almost everything, finding the minimum common ground necessary to produce a document. Madison did not win every argument. His fingerprints are all over the Constitution, but so are the fingerprints of compromise, of concession, of things he found deeply unsatisfactory that had to be accepted to save the larger project. That was perhaps the most important lesson he demonstrated that summer: knowing when to hold and when to yield, understanding the difference between the essential and the acceptable. On September 17, 1787, 39 delegates signed the Constitution of the United States. Not all of them were satisfied. 3 refused to sign entirely. Franklin, in his closing remarks, said he had learned enough from long experience to doubt his own judgment, and that the older he got, the more he suspected it might be wrong, and that therefore, despite his objections to several provisions, he signed the document and recommended that everyone else do the same. Madison signed. He had not gotten everything he wanted. He had gotten something more important, a framework that might actually work. The Constitution went to the states for ratification. The battle was not over. 9 states had to ratify before it could take effect, and opponents were fierce and well-organized. Madison would spend the next year writing with Hamilton and Jay, the Federalist Papers, 85 essays making the case for ratification that remain the most penetrating analysis of the Constitution ever written. He served in the first Congress. He drafted the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, addressing the most common objections to the original document. He became Secretary of State. He became the 4th President of the United States. He died in 1836 at 85 years old. The last surviving delegate of the Constitutional Convention. He outlived everyone else who had been in that room. The document he had carried into Philadelphia in the spring of 1787, written in those weeks of quiet preparation before anyone else arrived, refined and compromised and fought over through the sweltering summer, has now governed the United States for more than 2 centuries. It is the oldest written national constitution still in active use in the world. Its 3 branches, its checks and balances, its system of federalism balancing national and state power, its amendment process that allows it to change without requiring it to collapse, all of it traceable in its essential architecture to the Virginia plan that one quiet, slight, bookish Virginian carried into a room full of skeptics and placed on the table before the argument even began. He wrote the rules before anyone arrived, and the rules held. Next time, on Pivot Points. Women couldn't serve in the Continental Army. Everyone knew that. The law said so. The Army said so. Society said so. Deborah Sampson didn't ask for permission. She cut her hair, bound her chest, and enlisted under a dead man's name. She fought in skirmishes, captured enemy soldiers, took a musket ball in the thigh, and dug it out herself in the dark so no surgeon would discover the truth. She served for nearly 2 years before anyone found out. And then she spent 20 more fighting to make her country admit she'd been there at all. Deborah Sampson, next on Pivot Points.